Nicolas Cage is back in another wacky horror film from the producers of Mandy and the long-absent British director Richard Stanley, who here is adapting a very famous H.P. Lovecraft story. But is Colour Out of Space any good? The Gardner family have taken up residence in the middle of nowhere so that Dad Nathan can sell alpaca milk. It's a Nicolas Cage movie. Well, really it's not because of that. It's more like a way to get back to a more simple life after Mum Theresa survived breast cancer. All of that is thrown out the window when a strange meteorite lands in their back garden, and day by day a bizarre colour, unlike any seen on Earth, begins to infect the plants, wildlife, and eventually the Gardners themselves. If you're unfamiliar with H.P. Lovecraft, most of his work revolves around cosmic horror. It's this sort of fear of the unknown and how humanity is dwarfed by the immensity of creation. Fun stuff like that. Little things, cute stuff. It's a genre that he essentially created, or at least codified, so he's kind of a beloved writer in the horror community. Now, Lovecraft has his flaws. He's a little repetitive and he's a lot anti-Semitic, but the terrifying emptiness of that worldview has taken root in popular consciousness, with the so-called Cthulhu mythos basically becoming like a major pop cultural milestone. The Colour Out of Space, the short story, is a great starting point for Lovecraftian horror and a good short story in its own right, so it's definitely worth seeking out. The film does a pretty good job of adapting the tone, if not really the specifics, of that story. The colour slowly intrudes on life in the farm, firstly in these sort of subtle ways. The parents are more on edge than usual, the plants begin to have a bit of a strange tint to them, and so on. And then eventually it distorts the entire world of the film with these odd shimmering hazes, a vibrant purpley landscape, and very strange changes in character from the Gardners. But as it gets more and more apparent that the colour is having a malign influence on events, it sort of gets harder to justify why the characters stick around. And I think part of that is that what works in Lovecraft's 1920s setting doesn't really apply so easily to a modern world that has Wi-Fi and smartphones and stuff that's faster than a telegram. In the last third of the movie, the proverbial fan comes into contact with some proverbial waste product and everything goes a bit nuts. Now, here, Nicolas Cage's typical manic energy comes to the fore and he does some Cagean, interesting things. In this case, I describe his performance as sort of a Trump impersonation mixed with Cronenbergian body horror. And despite the constant marketing comparisons to Mandy, the films aren't really that similar. There's nothing here to match Panos Cosmatos', the director of Mandy, his singularly weird vision of what horror can be. But to be fair, director Richard Stanley keeps his hand on the rudder and the film never really runs out of energy, even as it occasionally veers off the rails a bit. It's actually really interesting watching a new Richard Stanley film, which is something that I thought I would never do, or at least was very unlikely to happen. Stanley shot to fame in the early 90s with these two great, relatively low budget features, Hardware and Dust Devil, and then he kind of crashed out of the industry when he was fired from the disastrous Island of Dr. Moreau movie made in the mid-90s, the one with Marlon Brando. That's a story, by the way, that's fascinating and very well documented in a film called Lost Soul, The Doomed Journey of Richard Stanley's The Island of Dr. Moreau. Bit of a long title, but it's available on Netflix, so you can always give that a watch. It explains the story really well. So now that he's back in the director's seat, I think Stanley does a pretty good job of pulling together some relatively disparate elements. The issue with the movie really is that there's plenty of goofy things that don't quite fit. There's stuff like Lavinia's Wicca practice, which never really comes to anything, alpaca milk farming, and the whole of Nicolas Cage's performance. But the overall effect of the movie is generally good, I think. It's a good shot at a Lovecraft adaptation, which, being about unknown terrors, is actually quite hard to bring to screen. And it has some chilling elements and some very clever visuals in it. Certainly it's enough to make me look forward to a second planned film, taking in another of Lovecraft's stories, the very famous short story, The Dunwich Horror. But anyway, that's it from me. I don't want to spoil too much, so I'm going to leave you to decide about what you think about the movie, but I'd love to have a chat with anyone who's watched the film in the comments below. And we could also talk about kind of other Lovecraftian type stuff that people have tried to do. The interesting thing with Lovecraft is there's been quite a few adaptations of his work, but they never really seem to get the sense of what people really like from his writing. And I think part of that is that he's a very characterful writer. It's not just the stories that people are interested in, but the way that he tells them specifically, which reminds me kind of like J.G. Ballard, where there's been lots of interesting stuff kind of made around Ballard, but I don't think there's been very many good films that are adaptations of Ballard's work. So I'd love to talk to you about Lovecraftian films that aren't based on Lovecraft's works. I think Annihilation is a really good example of this, and in fact this film visually reminded me a lot of that, so that's something we can definitely discuss. And I suppose there's that smaller subset of stuff that's technically adapted from Lovecraft, but is very little to do with him. Because, funnily enough, Creepshow's, what's it called? The Lonesome Death of Geordie Verrill, with Stephen King in the lead role, is actually basically a rip-off of Colour Out of Space. I think they might have even credited Lovecraft on the film. So anyway, that's it from me, but I hope we can have a lovely chat in the comments below. And don't forget to click the subscribe button and the bell next to it if you want to get a nod when my next video comes out. Have a good one. Bye for now.